All right, guys, so we're going to continue on in the I Am series. One, I kind of want to just take a pause really quick and just say how much fun it has been even for me as the teacher getting to walk through Genesis and kind of like in small groups especially. I've gotten to be in a couple of the guys' groups and hear you kind of go, okay, like, wow, I feel like I understand more of the Old Testament than I have ever understood before. And so for me, like getting to teach on this is really exciting because that's the very thing I wanted us to do, is to walk through Genesis, to be able to see these major characters, and then that way in the future, and at the end of this year, as we talk through like the New Testament, and they're going to talk about some of these different characters of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, that you would be able to understand, okay, this is who those people actually are. And so tonight what we're going to do, last week we talked about Isaac. We saw how the Lord actually provided for Isaac everything that he needed at the perfect time. And so tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Isaac's son, Jacob. And we're going to see that Jacob's story is actually a rocky story at the beginning. Jacob begins his story rocky, but he finishes it with a holy ending. So what do I mean by that? Well, first we need to jump into Genesis chapter 27. So you guys can go ahead, turn into your Bibles there. Genesis chapter 27. And we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 40, and I'm going to highlight kind of key things. Now, I want you to understand, Jacob is talked about here in Genesis from chapter 25 all the way through 49. If I did that tonight, you guys are literally going to be here for hours. Okay, so we're not going to go through everything, but I'm going to highlight some of these key things about his story that I think make him, things that he learned, but then also things that God was able to use him to be able to do in the future. So first thing I want us to see here in Genesis chapter 27 is that actually Jacob tricked his way into getting his brother's birthright and also his blessing. So if we want to understand all that's going to take place here in chapter 27, though, we're not going to turn there, but I want you to know what happened to Jacob in chapter 25. Because when we rewind back there, in that moment, in chapter 25, Jacob and his brother Esau are together. And Esau is returning from this hunting trip that he was on, and he's super, super hungry. And so he comes up to his brother Jacob, and he's like, man, I'm so hungry. I see that you're making this stew right now. Can I have some of that? And Jacob, being the brother that he is, like any sibling, goes, sure, but for a price. And so Esau's like, okay, what's your price that you're asking for? Well, he's like, oh, it's not that big. It's just that you need to sell me your birthright. Now, if you don't understand what a birthright, this is, one, an extremely high request, because what it's basically doing is the birthright goes to the one who would now receive the family leadership, and also the one who's going to receive the property of his father, Isaac. And so what he's literally saying is like, basically, give me all of the leadership and all of my dad's land, and yeah, I'll give you some stew. Like, do you understand that? Like, it's such a big request for something so small. And yet, here's the crazy thing, is that in that moment, Esau is so hungry, he says, sure. And he gives over his birthright to his brother Jacob. And so now, Jacob has somewhat tricked, somewhat not tricked his brother into giving him his birthright. So that's what's taking place in chapter 25. But now we skip ahead and we enter back into Genesis chapter 27. And so we start to read here in the first 4 verses this. It says, one day when Isaac was old and turning blind, this is a key thing, he's blind, he called for Esau, his older son, and he said, my son. Yes, father, Esau replied. I am an old man now, Isaac said, and I don't know when I may die. Take your bow and your quiver full of arrows and go out into the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare my favorite dish and bring it to me to eat. Then I will pronounce the blessing that belongs to you, my firstborn son, before I die. So here, what we start to see in the first 4 verses of 27 is that Isaac is nearing his death. And he's starting to look at his life. He's getting ready to give his son, his firstborn son Esau, his blessing. And so it's important to understand this about blessings, okay? First, a blessing, it provided final words of encouragement. So this is the moment when the father, if he wants to say anything for his son to remember the years that he's gone, he wants to kind of give those encouragements now. So this is an important moment. It also is this oral review of what each son would receive in physical property. So like in today's terms, we would often say like, okay, you're going to write a will, and then it says like, okay, so-and-so gets the house, so-and-so gets the car, so-and-so gets whatever, okay? So this would be the moment where a father in this time would be giving his blessing to his son and saying, this is what you receive, and this is what all of your siblings receive. But then also the blessing is important because it would provide this picture of some future rewards that would come for those who are being blessed. And so it's a moment where the father is saying, not only am I giving you maybe something right now, but I'm actually going to bless you far into your future. And God would honor that blessing. And so there's a lot of things that are taking place here when we talk about Esau starting to get this blessing from his father Isaac. And so Esau knows this. He knows what is all entailing in a blessing. And so he heads off into the wilderness. And he prepares to get his father's final meal. However, Isaac's wife, if you guys remember us talking about Rebecca last week, she overhears this. She overhears what Isaac's telling Esau. And you know what is funny is that Rebecca actually favors Jacob. She doesn't like Esau quite as much as she likes Jacob. And so, because of her loving Jacob just a little extra, she starts to create a scheme for her son Jacob. So she kind of plans this up and she goes, okay, what are we going to do? And so she said first, and this takes place in verse 9, she goes, okay, we're going to make Isaac's favorite meal. And I know what that is. But then I'm also going to have you put on some animal fur on your body, okay? Now, if you guys remember last week when Jacob and Esau were born, Esau was very long hair on his body, and they said it was really red. And so by putting on fur for Jacob, he would most likely look and feel like his father, or like his brother. And so he goes ahead, and she's like, okay, put all these clothes on. And so Jacob goes in to see his father. Now remember again, Isaac can't see very well anymore. He's pretty much practically blind. So all he's really doing is smelling and he's feeling to know if it's truly his son. And so Jacob walks in and his father starts to talk with him. And Isaac's not quite convinced at first that it truly is his son Esau. He's putting two and two together. He's starting to think through it, and he's going, okay, I mean, I just told you not that long ago to go out into the wilderness, and now all of a sudden you're back, and here you've got the food already prepped, and I don't know if you guys have ever cooked, but it doesn't happen very quickly typically, especially for stews. So all of these types of things are taking place where he's starting to think, is this truly my son Esau, or is this someone else? Also, could you also think about the voice? The voice would be like, okay, is that real? I should know what my son's voices are. And yet, that's probably why here in verses 21 through 27, that Isaac's starting to question it. But then, as he starts to come closer, he gives him his father's meal. And then his father grabs him and feels his hand. And guess what he feels? The fur. And so it feels similar to his son Esau. And then he's not quite convinced, so he actually has him lean in and then smells him. And he had put on clothes like his brother. And so he smelled like his brother who often is out in the wilderness. And so here in this moment, Isaac is smelling, he's feeling, and he's starting to realize, I think that maybe, even though the voice may not match, maybe this is Esau. And so Isaac begins to bless Jacob. And he says this in verse 28. From the dew of heaven and the richness of the earth, may God always give you abundant harvests of grain and bountiful new wine. May many nations become your servants, and may they bow down to you. May you be the master over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. All who curse you will be cursed, and all who bless you will be blessed. This is an impactful blessing that he's offering to his son Esau. Because what he's saying here is he's saying, I'm going to give you abundant harvests, abundant wine. I'm going to make many nations become your servant. I'm going to make you the master over your brothers, which as a sibling, that would be pretty sweet. Like if all of a sudden your father's like, you're going to be the master over all of your siblings, you'd be like, okay, yeah, I could be okay with that. And then it also says that all who curse you are not going to receive something good in the end. They're actually going to receive a curse. And then all who bless you will be blessed because of you. So all of these different things are playing into this blessing where it's a pretty big blessing. And honestly, what I would say is that Isaac really, in this moment, didn't leave much out of his blessing. And so he's giving it all to what he believes is his son Esau. But now, of course, Jacob walks away from the situation. He's going, I got the birthright and I got the blessing from my brother. So he's tricked his brother in multiple ways at this point. And now, of course, what's going to happen? Well, Esau finds animals. He kills them. He brings them back. He makes the stew. He goes in to see his father. And in this moment, he's ready to receive his blessing. And so he runs in and he says, Father, I'm ready. And then they both realize, Isaac and Esau, that Jacob tricked them. And so we pick up in verse 36. And Esau exclaimed, no wonder his name is Jacob, for now he's cheated me twice. First, he took my rights as the firstborn, and now he's stolen my blessing. Oh, haven't you saved me even one blessing? Isaac said to Esau, I have made Jacob your master, and have declared all of his brothers will be his servants. I have guaranteed him an abundance of grain and wine. What left is there for me to give you, my son? Esau pleaded, but you only have one blessing. Oh, my father, bless me too. And then Esau broke down and wept. And finally, his father Isaac said to him, you will live away from richness. Oh, this is a good blessing here. You will live away from richness of the earth and away from the dew of the heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you decide to break free, you will shake his yoke from your neck. The reality is, in this moment, Esau's blessing is not a very good blessing. I mean, like, reread that. You're going to live away from riches. You're going to live by the sword. You're going to serve your brother. And then eventually you may decide to break free from all this, and you will. But like the blessing that Esau should have received of all these abundance of grain and wine and being the master of his siblings, he doesn't get any of those things. Instead, he gets the opposite of those things. And so here in this moment, Esau is angry with the situation that he's been placed in. And part of us would say rightfully so. I mean, he was cheated by his brother. And yet, because of Esau's anger, his mother realizes that Esau is so angry that he might get to the point of killing Jacob. And so she, in panic, sends Jacob away and says, I want you to leave because your brother may kill you. Now, I want you to understand one thing. Jacob's name is really interesting in this whole situation. Because when you look at Hebrew and you break down the meaning of Jacob's name, it actually means supplanter, which then also means to take the place of. And so in this moment, we literally see that take place, that Jacob took the place of Esau. He took the place of his birthright. He took the place of his blessing. And so here, that's why Esau says, man, it's so ironic that his name is Jacob, because he's literally tricked me twice and he's taken the place of me twice. And so here, Jacob has done honestly wrong by his brother. And yet, when I fast forward and I start to think of today, I want you to ask yourself this question. Have you ever experienced a moment where you've been tricked or where you've been wronged by another person? I bet many of us could answer yes, like we've been wronged by people before. Maybe we've been tricked by people before. Maybe you felt that you've been that person that's tricked someone, that's wronged someone. Whichever person you have been or maybe are, you know there's a tension that takes place between those two individuals. And so maybe what I want us to think through tonight and to start to ponder as we go through the rest of Jacob's story is, has there ever been moments where you've sidestepped God's plan for your life? And if so, what I want you to do tonight is to actually continue to listen to Jacob's story of what happens, because God shows up in really cool ways that are unexpected and not warranted. Because in the next part, what we start to see in Genesis chapter 28 is that even after Jacob's trickery, even after he took the place of his brother, God gave a blessing to Jacob and his family. So here we pick up in Genesis chapter 28. Jacob has fled. He's run off. And now his father, though, has one request of him. And it's very similar to the request for Isaac, his father, back in the day. And it was that if he was going to marry someone, that it would be someone from his family line and from the Israelite people, because they would be walking in step with God. And so Isaac's one request of his son is that I want you to find a woman who is loving God, and that's going to help you love him better too. And so Jacob heads off. He runs away from his brother. And we pick back up into the story with Jacob going to this land called Padan Aram. But he stops for the night before he arrives there. And the Lord visits him here in this dream, and he blesses him. And this is where we pick up in verse 13, because it says this. So he's sleeping right now, and he's dreaming of this stairway that's going from earth up into heaven. And it says, at the top of the stairway stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your grandfather Abraham, the God of your father Isaac. The ground you are laying on belongs to you, and I am giving it to you and your descendants. Your descendants will be as numerous as the dust of the earth, and they will spread out in all directions, to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants. What's more, I am with you. I will protect you wherever you go. One day, I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've finished giving you everything that I have promised you. See, when we read this, honestly, it's a little shocking. Because the reality is that God continues his promises that he gave to Abraham to his son Isaac. And now, even though his son Jacob stole these things from his brother, his birthright and his blessing, God blesses Jacob in this moment. Jacob here is changed because of this encounter with God. And honestly, when I read through this, I find it remarkable because honestly, God could have given up on Jacob. I mean, God knew all the situation that was taking place between the two brothers, that he was tricking his brother, that he was tricking his father. God could have said, you know what? You did me wrong. I'm done with you. And then not only that, but then God could have wiped out Jacob. We see it countlessly throughout Genesis, throughout the Old Testament, that God sometimes when people would sin against him, boom, they'd be dead. Or they would get wiped out by a different nation. God could have done that for Jacob in this situation. He could have just said, you know what? You are lying and you're dead. Could have. But instead, what God chose in this moment was to restore Jacob back to himself. God chose to call Jacob and say, come, follow me, even though you've done wrong to your brother and to your father. And here's what is amazing. God can do the same thing tonight. No matter where you are at. God can call you back to himself, whether you're close to him, whether you're far from him. And so what we see now is that Jacob arrives here in Padan Aram. And he stays with his uncle Laban. And here's one thing that I was telling Bree that I was like blown away by. You always we always say like you continue to learn things about the Bible even when you're older and you've read it a lot. But like the same was true for me this week. So here's the thing. So we pick up here in Genesis, and Laban is talked about once again. We're introduced to Laban. Now, if you don't remember last week, when Isaac, so Jacob's father, went and was having Rebekah, his wife, getting chosen by the servant that went and found him, he went to the house of Laban. And there he found Rebekah and brought Rebekah back and married Rebekah and Isaac. Now, we fast forward years later, and Jacob is traveling back into his family's or his relative's country, and he comes across a man named Laban, which is ultimately his uncle. And so now we're picking back up in the story, and I don't know why I never connected those two things, but here, years later, God is reorchestrating all of these things, and we're going to pick up in the story here. Because in chapter 29, verse 14, we start to read this. After Jacob had stayed with Laban for about a month, Laban said to him, "You shouldn't work for me without pay just because we're relatives. Tell me, how much should your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The older daughter was named Leah, and the younger one was Rachel. There was no sparkle in Leah's eyes. Okay, it's not the nicest thing to say, but there was no sparkle in Leah's eyes. But Rachel had a beautiful figure and a lovely face. And since Jacob was in love with Rachel, go figure, he told her father, "I'll work for you for, get this, 7 years, and then you'll give me Rachel, your younger daughter, as my wife." And so here we pick up into the story. Jacob is faithfully serving his uncle's family. And Jacob is interested in a certain girl, his daughter. And so here Laban is starting to ask, "What do you request of me? I feel bad that you're working for me for free, and so I want to give you a fair wage." And so he requests to marry Rachel here, who's Laban's daughter. But get this, the striking thing for me is he's already been working for him for so long, and then he literally says, "Okay, fine, I'll have you pay me, but I want to marry your daughter, and I'll work for you for another 7 years in order to get your daughter." So he's committing all of this countless amount of time to Laban in order to marry Rachel. But then we read verse 20, and so Jacob worked 7 years to pay for Rachel, but get this, his love for her was so strong that it seemed to him but a few days. Yeah, exactly. Gag me. Literally, I'm like, oh my goodness, the Bible here is trying to set up this horrible love story thing. But I mean, okay, so Jacob is very much so fallen in love with Rachel. And, he says he's buying, but it honestly is more it's just, that was kind of the time of how they would work and they would do it. So, okay, yeah, it's the dowry, yeah, exactly. Okay, so here, now get this. So the time comes to marry Rachel, and there's a surprising turn of events here that take place. Because Jacob, the trickster, gets tricked. Because Laban goes ahead so again, like women in this time when they would get married are like wearing veils, so you can't really see their face. So here, Jacob comes to the wedding ceremony, and he is exchanging these vows with this woman, supposedly Rachel, and finally, the wedding's over. And he realizes, the less sparkle daughter is the one that he just married, Leah. That Jacob had, or that his uncle, well, now his father-in-law, Laban, had tricked him and made him marry Leah, the oldest daughter. And so, of course, Jacob's upset, rightfully so. But yet, it's so funny because then Jacob goes, you know what, you've wronged me, but I still want to marry Rachel. And so he says, you know what, here's what I'll do. If you let me marry Rachel as well, then I'll work for you for another 7 years. And then I can marry Rachel. And so basically what happens here is that Laban agrees, and so he allows Rachel to be married to Jacob in this moment. But then Jacob goes and he starts to work for Laban for this next 7 years. And so there's a lot of things that honestly, in between all this time, that I'm going to skip over tonight because we have like very limited amount of time. But there's a ton that happens between Jacob, between Leah, and between Rachel. And honestly, a lot of it's very similar to Isaac and his wife, where there's all of these disagreements that happen. Like Rachel can't have children. Leah can. Leah has a lot of children. Rachel's really upset that she has a lot of children. Now all of a sudden she starts having Jacob have more children with her slave girl. And so then all of a sudden Leah's upset. And then she's now not very happy either. So there's tons of things that are taking place in this family that are going on. Okay? So basically I just covered a ton of different years that took place between all these people. But I want us to get this, and I want to focus on what happens in this family line. Tons going on. But we get a better understanding when we take a look at Genesis chapter 35. And we're not going to turn there, but here's what it reads. The sons of Leah, okay? So Leah's the one without sparkle. Were Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then it says the sons of Rachel. Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. And then there's these ones. These are the slave girls that still get considered as part of the family. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, were Dan and Naphtali. And then the sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, crazy things are happening, were Gad and Asher. These are the names of the sons who were born to Jacob at Padan Aram. See, these children, and the reason that I wanted to talk through what all was happening, are extremely important for the rest of the entire Bible. Because there are 12 sons that have been born to Jacob. And if you know anything about the Old Testament into the New Testament, is that these become the 12 nations of Israel. That tons of different ways in which God works happen through each one of these family lines. And so in this moment, what's crazy is we've been going through for the past couple weeks watching one family generation go to one other family generation that goes to the next. Here all of a sudden it explodes. This is the moment where God is starting to truly take shape of where he says your descendants will be as many as the sand on the seashore or the stars in the sky. Is that God is using all of these men to now carry on this family legacy, this blessing of God. And so there's a huge amount that's starting to take place with Jacob's story in this moment. And so a question that I have is, did God ever actually restore Jacob's relationship with Esau? Or did they just never figure it out? Because here they're in different lands now. They're not interacting with one another. But then what I want us to see and what we conclude tonight with is that God restores Jacob's broken past. And this goes back to where we're talking about how God started out with Jacob being in a tricky spot, a rocky bottom spot, to where God ends with a holy ending. Because here, God restores Jacob's broken past. And so we come to the point in chapter 31 where Jacob and Laban are starting to have some disagreements, some tension that's taking place. So he and his father-in-law aren't getting along very well because God just keeps blessing Jacob, just like he said he would. And so Jacob literally will have all these sheep that are of one color. And then Laban would get all of maybe some speckled sheep over here. And then Jacob would have all these sheep, and then God would just make them produce like crazy. And there would be a ton of them. And then Laban would get all upset that he had, man, I gave you all the good sheep. And so he gets all upset about that. And so Jacob then basically says, okay, well, then you give me the speckled sheep. And then so Jacob would go over to the speckled sheep. And then God would crazy produce all of those sheep, and now all of a sudden he has more than Laban again. And Laban's like, this isn't fair. You keep just having all these blessings poured upon you. And so there's this tension that's taking place between the two of them. And so Jacob finally comes to this moment where he says, you know what, I'm done. I'm heading back to my homeland, back to where my family was originally from. And so also back to his brother Esau. And so here we pick up in chapter 32, and we start to see what takes place. And so what I want us to do is let's go ahead, turn to chapter 32, and we're going to read verses 3 through 5. It says this: Then Jacob sent messengers ahead to his brother. So he's already in the land. So he sends this message to his brother, who's living in the region of Seir, in the land of Edom. And he told them, give this message to my master Esau. Humble greetings from your servant Jacob. Until now I have been living with Uncle Laban, and now I own cattle, donkeys, flocks of sheep and goats, and many servants, both men and women. Again, God answering all these blessings. And I have sent these messengers to inform my Lord of my coming, hoping that you will be friendly to me. So Jacob's going back in this moment to the land of his brother, and he sends out, honestly, a white flag. Because, last time he left, he knew that his brother might want to kill him. So in a situation of war, people will often hold a white flag saying that they're coming in peace. And so that's really what Jacob's doing in this moment, is saying, brother Esau, I'm coming in peace. And then in verses 6 through 8, what we start to see is that Jacob hears reports that Esau is coming. And that Esau is coming with 600 men from his army, or 400 men of his army. And so Jacob in this moment hears of this, and he starts to plan on how he's going to appease his brother, how he's going to make his brother happy again. And he honestly does it by breaking up all of his different possessions and sending them in different directions. And he starts to give them to his brother of your servant Jacob gives this to you. Your servant Jacob gives this to you. Your servant Jacob, again, servant, not master. He's giving all of these different things to his brother Esau. But then there's something that's interesting that starts to take place in verses 22 through 32. Because all of a sudden it takes a break. He's giving all these things. He hasn't yet seen his brother. And yet, God shows up. And there's this interesting encounter that takes place for Jacob with God. An encounter where it says that Jacob actually was wrestling with this man at night. He wrestled with him for hours. And it said that it was God. And so it's kind of like this weird break in the situation, because you're like, okay, what's going on here? They're wrestling for hours, and then finally these two guys one guy can't beat the other guy, and so basically the one dude that's not Jacob hits his hip and breaks it. And all these things are taking place where it's okay, what's happening here? So Jacob's hip is wrenched out of his socket. And then, at this moment, he's kind of he's hurting. But he did it because it says that he didn't, this man couldn't beat him. And then what we start to see is an amazing transformation that God does in Jacob's heart here. Because in this moment, God changes Jacob's name. And again, this is extremely important for the rest of the Bible. Because it changes his name from Jacob, supplanter, taking the place of, to Israel, which means he who strives with God, or he who wrestles with God. And so in this moment, again, understand this, when God changes people's names in the Bible, it's a huge life transformation that's taking place. And now Israel is going to be the one who's talked about for the rest of the Bible. And so here in this moment, God is doing a work in Jacob's heart. But then we step back into Jacob and Esau. So here he's wrestled with God. His name has been changed. And then we re-see that Jacob and Esau come back together. Because in chapter 33, verse 1, it says, "Then Jacob looked up, and he saw Esau coming with his 400 men. And so he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and his 2 servant wives. And he put the servant wives and their children at the front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph last." Okay, you can also see favoritism in this whole situation because he puts the least important in the very front and the most important in the very back, which would be Rachel. And then Jacob went on ahead. As he approached his brother, he bowed to the ground 7 times before him. And then Esau ran to him to meet him and to kill him. I'm just kidding. That's not what it says. And it says, and embraced him. And he threw his arms around his neck and he kissed him. And they both wept. See, in this moment, Esau threw aside all of the hurt. He threw aside all of the things of how his brother tricked him. And all he wanted was to be reunited with his brother, to be made right with his brother. And Jacob here in this moment, all he wants is to be reunited with his brother. This would be a moment that would rewrite history for God's people, that would shape the rest of the Old Testament into the New Testament. And honestly, what I believe that Jacob's story truly shows us tonight is a really important truth. No matter who you are, no matter what you have done, no matter what you are doing, no matter what you will do, God desires to call you home. God desires to create a holy ending to your story in the same way that he did for Jacob. So what I want us to do here now is our now what's. First, I want you to start off with doing this. Find one way that you relate with Jacob from the story. Okay? So find one way that you relate with him. But then here's the next thing. For the last 2 minutes, we're going to sit here. I want you to make literally no sound. Okay? No papers rattling, nothing. Okay? This is going to be an exercise too because it's hard. Okay? But for the next 2 minutes, I want you guys to pause, to ask God how he wants to work in your heart, and to look more like himself. I want you guys to think through, okay, God, and maybe for you, you've heard this story tonight, and you've gone, okay, this is how I can grow. So then talk to God about that. Maybe for some of you, you haven't, and that's okay. What I want you to do right now is, honestly, we never do this in our culture, to take a moment where you do nothing and just say, God, I want to hear from you. So for the next 2 minutes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to ask God, how do you want to work in my life? Much like you worked in Jacob's. Okay? So beginning now. God, I thank you for the way in which you allow us to take moments of quiet to hear from you. God, I just ask that each one of these students would be able to take the ways in which you were speaking to them tonight, to live it out in their lives. And that ultimately we would look like you, that we'd love like you, that our lives would be transformed like Jacob's. So we thank you for how you worked in his life, but how you're also working in our lives too. And so now I ask that we would just have a great time in small groups and that it would be honoring to you. In Jesus' name.